Nathaniel Hayes sat in the back of his luxury car, staring out the window as the cityscape blurred past. It had been 6 long months since he left for a business trip overseas, and the weight of his absence was finally about to be lifted. He had missed his wife, Olivia, more than he could express, but there was something else weighing on his heart: the arrival of their daughter, Emma. After years of struggling with infertility, they had finally been blessed with the child they had longed for, but he hadn't even met her yet. The anticipation gnawed at him, filling him with a strange mixture of excitement and nervousness. "Almost there, Mr. Hayes," Mark, his driver, said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but Nathaniel could sense the subtle tension in the air, as if Mark, too, understood the significance of this moment. "Everything's in order at the hospital." Nathaniel nodded, grateful for the reassurance, but his mind was racing. He thought about Olivia, how she must have endured the difficulties of childbirth alone, navigating the early days of motherhood without him by her side. The thought filled him with guilt, but also with an overwhelming desire to be there for her now, to be the husband and father they both needed. As they pulled up to the hospital, Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat. The building loomed before him, sterile and imposing, but it held the key to his happiness. The doors of the car opened, and Mark stepped out to help him. Nathaniel's legs were shaky as he made his way toward the entrance, but his excitement pushed him forward, faster than he'd ever moved before. Inside, his mother, Grace, was waiting. Her warm smile greeted him, but there was a tension in her eyes, a flicker of something Nathaniel couldn't quite place. She embraced him, holding him tightly, and for a moment, he felt the comfort of home, the familiar scent of her perfume, the steady rhythm of her breathing. "She's waiting for you," Grace said softly, pulling back to look at him. "Olivia's in the maternity ward with Emma." Nathaniel's heart fluttered at the mention of his daughter's name. He followed Grace down the corridor, the quiet hum of the hospital filling the space between them. As they reached Olivia's room, the door swung open to reveal her sitting in the chair by the window, cradling their newborn daughter in her arms. Olivia looked up at him, her tired eyes lighting up with relief and love. "Nathaniel," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "you're here." He walked toward her, his heart pounding. For a moment, he simply stared at the tiny bundle in her arms. Emma, their little miracle. She was so small, so fragile, yet perfect in every way. Olivia smiled, her exhaustion forgotten in the face of their joy. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" "She's more than I ever imagined," Nathaniel said, his voice breaking. He reached out to touch Emma's tiny hand, his emotions overwhelming him. The family gathered around, their joy palpable. Yet, as Nathaniel stood there, something lingered in the back of his mind, a faint unease he couldn't shake. There was a strange feeling in the air, something he couldn't quite place. His gaze flickered to the corner of the room, where Mark stood quietly, waiting. Mark was Olivia's trusted assistant, a quiet presence in the background, but Nathaniel had noticed a strange look pass between him and Grace earlier. It didn't feel right, but for now, he pushed it aside. This was a moment to celebrate, not to dwell on odd feelings. The next few hours passed in a blur of visitors and well-wishers, and Nathaniel felt as though he were floating through the day, swept along by the joy and chaos surrounding Emma's birth. Olivia seemed to be doing well, though her exhaustion was evident. The nurses came and went, checking on her and Emma, and there was a steady stream of congratulations and advice from family members. Despite the celebrations, there were moments of tension. Nathaniel noticed that Olivia struggled with breastfeeding, and the nurses had to step in to help, offering donor milk in the meantime. Olivia looked frustrated, her brow furrowing with each failed attempt. Nathaniel could see the strain in her eyes, but he knew it was a temporary setback, one they would overcome together. He held her hand, offering words of reassurance, though he, too, felt a knot of concern tighten in his stomach. Was something wrong? "She'll get it," Nathaniel said gently, trying to soothe Olivia. "You're both adjusting. It's a lot to take in." Olivia gave him a tired smile, but the doubt lingered in her eyes. "I hope so. I want to give her everything she needs." Nathaniel kissed her forehead. "We'll figure it out. Together." But as the day wore on, Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that there was something beneath the surface, something more than the usual post-birth exhaustion and nerves. His mother and Mark had been strangely quiet, and there was a tension in the room whenever Grace and Olivia spoke in hushed tones. It wasn't enough to raise alarm, but it was enough to make Nathaniel uneasy. He pushed the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the beautiful little girl in front of him. He promised himself he would focus on the present, on Emma, on Olivia. There would be time to confront whatever lingered later. As the evening drew to a close, Nathaniel stood by the window, looking out at the city skyline, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the family he had. Yet, in the back of his mind, the unease remained. Something was wrong. He couldn't explain it, but he would find out what it was. The next day, Nathaniel and Olivia settled into a routine at the hospital, with visitors coming and going, and the nurses monitoring Emma's progress. There was a quiet calm in the room, but the unease Nathaniel had felt the night before continued to gnaw at him. It wasn't just the breastfeeding issues or Olivia's exhaustion. It was something deeper, something more unsettling. As he sat by Olivia's side, watching her tend to Emma, his mind wandered back to the conversation he had overheard between his mother and Mark. It was nothing overt, nothing he could point to as a reason for his discomfort, but there was a subtle shift in the way they spoke. They had talked briefly about a homeless woman, something about helping her out. It didn't seem like a big deal, but there was an odd emphasis on the woman's situation, and Mark's face had been tense when he mentioned it. Nathaniel tried to push the thought aside, but it kept creeping back into his mind. He'd seen the woman briefly the night he arrived. She had been standing outside the hospital, a forlorn figure in the cold. Was that why Mark seemed so uncomfortable? Was she someone they had helped? Why had it stuck in his mind so insistently? He excused himself from the room, telling Olivia he was going to grab a coffee from the hospital cafe. He needed to clear his head, to think. The day had been full of small conversations that hadn't quite fit together, like puzzle pieces that didn't align. Nathaniel wasn't sure why, but he needed to understand what was going on. His instincts were on high alert, and he could feel that something was off, even if he couldn't yet articulate it. As he walked down the corridor, he passed Mark, who was standing outside the nurse's station. Their eyes met briefly, and Nathaniel saw a flicker of tension in Mark's expression before he quickly turned away. Nathaniel didn't stop to speak to him. Instead, he made his way to the exit, determined to clear his mind. But as he stepped outside, the weight of his thoughts pressed down on him even harder. Something wasn't right. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He needed answers. The next day, Nathaniel stood at the hospital entrance, his hand lingering on the door as he looked back at Olivia and their daughter Emma. The visit had been a whirlwind of emotions, joy, concern, exhaustion, but it was time to leave. Nathaniel was eager to take Olivia and Emma home, to settle into their new life as a family, but something still gnawed at him. The strange feeling that had been with him since his return to the hospital hadn't gone away. In fact, it was only growing stronger, like a dark cloud hanging overhead. "Are you okay?" Olivia's voice broke through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. He smiled at her, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired, I guess." Olivia didn't seem convinced, but she didn't press further. She gently cradled Emma, who was asleep in her arms, her tiny face serene despite the chaos that had enveloped their lives in recent days. They made their way to the car, and Nathaniel settled into the passenger seat, his mind still racing. As Mark drove them back to their home, Nathaniel's thoughts kept drifting back to the same questions. The homeless woman, his mother's strange behavior, Mark's quiet discomfort. There was something off about the entire situation. But what? Nathaniel tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on his family, on Emma, on the life they were about to build together. But he couldn't ignore the nagging sense that something was wrong. At home, the house felt quieter than usual. The silence was thick, and as they settled in, Nathaniel found himself noticing the little things. The way his mother was unusually quiet, retreating to her room soon after their arrival. The way Mark seemed to be avoiding eye contact, his face drawn and tense. Olivia, too, seemed distracted, lost in her own thoughts, her smile not quite as bright as it had been at the hospital. Nathaniel tried to push past it all, focusing on the small, mundane tasks of getting Emma settled in her crib and making sure Olivia was comfortable. But as the day wore on, the sense of unease only deepened. When he went out to pick up some baby formula from the nearby store, he realized something that made his stomach drop. The hospital had forgotten to provide Olivia's prescription for her medication, something that should have been taken care of before they left. He stood in the store aisle, staring at the shelves of baby products, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. It wasn't just the oversight. It was the fact that it had slipped through the cracks at all. Olivia's health had been so important to him, so why hadn't anyone made sure everything was in order? His mind returned to the conversation between his mother and Mark, to the fleeting mention of the homeless woman. It all seemed to be coming together in a way he didn't understand, and the pieces didn't fit. He grabbed the medication and hurried back home, his mind racing with possibilities. Something wasn't right. He could feel it, deep in his bones. He had to find out what was really going on. But as he arrived home, the house was even quieter than before. It was as though the walls themselves were holding secrets, waiting for him to uncover them. That night, Nathaniel couldn't sleep. The quiet house was oppressive, and his thoughts were too loud, too insistent to ignore. He tossed and turned in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every moment from the past few days. Every glance, every conversation that seemed off, every odd look between his mother and Mark. What was it all leading to? As the hours dragged on, Nathaniel finally gave up on trying to sleep. He left the bedroom quietly, not wanting to wake Olivia or Emma. The house was dark, save for the soft glow of the kitchen light. He moved through the hallways with quiet steps, his mind still racing. He passed by his mother's room and stopped, as though something was pulling him toward it. There was a faint light seeping from beneath the door. Nathaniel hesitated for a moment before quietly pushing the door open. He had expected to find her asleep, but instead, Grace was sitting in the corner of the room, her back to him. She was talking to someone on the phone in a low voice, her words too soft to make out. Nathaniel's pulse quickened as he heard the conversation continue. "It's done. She's home. Everything is in place." His mother's voice was calm, almost rehearsed. There was a pause as the person on the other end of the line spoke. Grace's response was equally soft but filled with an edge of finality. "Yes, she'll never know. We've got everything under control." Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat, and he stepped back, heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't supposed to hear this. It wasn't meant for his ears. But the words lingered in the air, sharp and unmistakable. Everything was in place. They had everything under control. Who were they talking about? What did this have to do with Emma? He retreated down the hallway, his mind spinning with confusion. He felt as if he were drowning in a sea of unanswered questions, and every answer he uncovered seemed to raise more questions. He returned to his bedroom, his heart heavy with the weight of what he'd just overheard. Olivia stirred in her sleep as Nathaniel climbed back into bed, but he lay there awake for hours, replaying the conversation in his head. It felt like the beginning of a nightmare, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to take shape, but Nathaniel didn't know what the picture was yet. All he knew was that something was deeply wrong, and he had to find out what it was. The next morning, Nathaniel confronted his mother. He couldn't let it go any longer. He needed to know what she had meant by her conversation, what she had been hiding. When Grace tried to brush it off, he didn't back down. His instincts told him that the truth was far more sinister than he could have imagined. As Nathaniel continued to observe his family over the following days, the unease in his gut only deepened. He spent time with Emma, holding her and marveling at her tiny hands and delicate features. But even in those precious moments, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Olivia, ever the calm and loving mother, seemed to have an answer for everything. When Nathaniel expressed concern about Emma's appearance, her slightly unusual skin tone, the way her eyes seemed to lack the spark of life, they all seemed like trivial worries to her. She brushed them off with a gentle smile, dismissing his doubts as new parent anxiety. But Nathaniel couldn't ignore it. Every time he looked at Emma, something felt out of place. His suspicions grew stronger as the days wore on. His mother was evasive whenever he asked about her conversation, her answers always vague and incomplete. Mark, too, was becoming more distant. avoiding eye contact and retreating into the background whenever Nathaniel tried to confront him. It was the little things that added up, the strange tension between his family members, the way they acted as though they were hiding something. Nathaniel didn't know what it was, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about a newborn baby. There was something much darker at play, and he was determined to find out what it was, no matter where the truth would lead him. The days following Nathaniel's unsettling discoveries passed in a blur. His mind remained preoccupied with the fragmented pieces of information he had gathered. His mother's strange conversation, the odd tension in the house, and most troubling of all, the subtle sense that something about Emma wasn't quite right. His unease had grown into a persistent ache, gnawing at him during every quiet moment. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The question that had been slowly building in his mind now screamed for attention. What was really going on with his family? One afternoon, after another restless night, Nathaniel decided he couldn't wait any longer. He needed answers, and he needed them now. He had to confront his mother, to demand the truth. But he also knew he couldn't do it alone. He had to be careful. Olivia, still immersed in the tenderness of new motherhood, might not understand the weight of what was happening. She had been distracted by the demands of caring for Emma, her exhaustion growing by the day. Nathaniel knew that if he were to uncover the full extent of the truth, it had to be now, before it was too late. With determination, he picked up his phone and dialed Mark's number. The assistant had been acting more and more distant, but Nathaniel trusted him, or at least he had, before the last few weeks. The call rang several times before Mark finally answered, his voice low, almost too quiet. Nathaniel? Mark's voice was strained, as if he were expecting this call. Is everything okay? I need to talk to you, Nathaniel said, his words firm. It's about Emma. Mark hesitated, and Nathaniel could hear the sound of shifting in the background, as though Mark were moving away from a more public space. What about her? I need to know the truth, Nathaniel replied, his voice tight with tension. I've seen enough. I've heard enough. I know something's wrong. I don't know how far this goes, but I won't sit in the dark anymore. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Mark spoke quietly, almost in a whisper. Meet me at the cafe in an hour. Don't tell anyone. We can't talk over the phone. Nathaniel's heart beat faster. This was it, the moment where everything would come crashing down. He thanked Mark and ended the call, feeling his pulse quicken as he prepared to confront the reality of what his family had been hiding. An hour later, Nathaniel sat in a small, dimly lit cafe on the edge of town, his hands wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee, his mind whirling. The minutes dragged by, and the anticipation gnawed at him. Was he about to uncover the most unimaginable betrayal? Was the truth far darker than he could even begin to comprehend? Mark finally arrived, his face tight with stress, his usually calm demeanor replaced by one of visible discomfort. He slid into the chair across from Nathaniel, casting a quick glance around to ensure no one was paying attention. Then, in a low voice, he began. I didn't want to be the one to tell you, Nathaniel, Mark started, his eyes darting to the side, avoiding Nathaniel's gaze. But it's time you knew. Nathaniel leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. Tell me what? What's been going on? What are you hiding from me? Mark took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. Your mother. She's been involved in something she hasn't told you about. The woman you've been seeing around town, the one who's homeless. She's the one who... Mark faltered, unable to finish the sentence. Nathaniel's stomach churned, and he could feel his mind racing as he tried to piece together the information. What about the woman? Nathaniel pressed, his voice hardening. What does she have to do with Emma? Mark glanced around one more time before finally meeting Nathaniel's gaze, his voice a whisper. She's Emma's biological mother. Nathaniel felt his breath catch in his throat. The words were like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, he was too stunned to react. What are you talking about? He managed to say, his voice low and disbelieving. That doesn't make sense. Emma is mine. Olivia and I. We've been... Mark interrupted him, his voice breaking under the weight of what he had to say. No, Nathaniel. Your mother. She's the one who arranged it all. She found the homeless woman, made a deal with her to carry the child for you and Olivia. The baby Emma is not yours. She's not your biological daughter. Nathaniel's head spun. The ground beneath him seemed to tilt, and for a moment, everything went black around the edges of his vision. His mind struggled to process the truth, but the implications were too heavy, too overwhelming. Mark continued, his voice strained. I didn't want to be part of this, but your mother, she insisted. She said it was the only way to make everything work, to give you and Olivia the child you wanted. She paid the woman, gave her money, a place to stay, all for this. Nathaniel's thoughts collided, the reality of Mark's words crashing into him like a tidal wave. His mind flickered back to his first encounter with Emma, the odd sense that something had been off about her. His growing unease, the conversations he'd overheard. None of it had made sense until now. He had been living in a lie, a carefully constructed illusion of a perfect family, when in truth, everything had been built on a foundation of deceit. As the weight of the revelation sank in, Nathaniel's mind began to race. His mother, Grace, had been orchestrating a scheme to deceive him and Olivia for months, manipulating every aspect of their lives. He had trusted her, loved her, and now, he felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. Why? Why would she do this? Nathaniel whispered, his voice shaking with disbelief. Why would she lie about something like this? Mark shook his head. I don't know, Nathaniel, but your mother is dangerous, and she's been hiding the truth for a long time. She's the one who arranged for Emma to be born, and she's been covering her tracks ever since. She'll do anything to protect herself. Anything. Nathaniel felt a coldness settle over him, a deep and bone-chilling realization dawning on him. The woman he had trusted, the one who had raised him, had destroyed everything for the sake of a lie. And now, that lie had infected his entire life, his marriage, and his new family. I have to confront her, Nathaniel muttered, his voice low and steady with newfound determination. I need to know everything. Mark nodded, his face grim. Be careful, Nathaniel. Your mother will stop at nothing to protect herself, and she'll take anyone down who stands in her way. Nathaniel didn't say anything in response. His mind was already racing, and he knew the only thing that mattered now was uncovering the truth, no matter the cost. Back at home, Nathaniel's mind was spinning with everything Mark had revealed. He couldn't go on living a lie. He had to confront his mother, demand the truth, and face the consequences of the deception she had masterminded. But as he stepped through the door, his stomach churned with a sense of impending dread. Nathaniel found Grace in the living room, sitting calmly, as if nothing was wrong. The cold look in her eyes sent a chill through him. He stood still for a moment, gathering his thoughts before he finally spoke. Mom, we need to talk, Nathaniel said, his voice steely. About Emma. About everything. Grace didn't flinch. I don't know what you mean, she said, her tone cool and detached. Nathaniel stepped forward, his resolve hardening. I know about the homeless woman. I know what you've done. I know Emma isn't my daughter. For a moment, Grace said nothing. Then, in a voice as cold as ice, she finally spoke. You have no idea what you're talking about. But Nathaniel could see it in her eyes, the guilt, the fear. She had been caught. The truth was about to come crashing down. Nathaniel could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he stood there, facing his mother. Her icy composure only made the situation more suffocating, as if the walls around them were closing in with every passing second. He had thought he was prepared for this moment, but as the words left his mouth, he realized how much he had underestimated the depth of his mother's deception. Grace stood up slowly, her expression cold and unreadable. You don't know what you're saying, she repeated, her voice even, though there was a slight tremor in her hands. I did what I had to do to give you what you wanted. What I wanted. Nathaniel could hardly believe his own words. You've ruined everything. You've stolen my daughter's future. And for what? What could possibly justify something like this? Grace's eyes flickered for a moment, a flash of guilt crossing her face before she masked it with an air of defiance. You wouldn't understand. You can't. I did it for you, Nathaniel. I thought I was helping. I gave you a chance at a family, a perfect family. Nathaniel's mind was reeling. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. A perfect family? You've built it on lies. You've destroyed everything for a perfect lie. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. I can't let this go, Mom. I won't. Grace took a step toward him, her voice dropping to a whisper. Do you really think you can just walk away from this? Do you think the police will believe you? You've been part of this, whether you like it or not. The whole thing was set up, Nathaniel. You and Olivia were complicit in it. They'll never believe you when you start pointing fingers. The words hit Nathaniel like a slap across the face. He had been part of this, hadn't he? He had been so focused on his family's happiness that he had never once questioned the way things had unfolded. He had trusted his mother, had trusted her judgment, and now that trust had shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. As Grace's words sunk in, Nathaniel's determination only grew stronger. I don't care. I'm not letting you get away with this. I'll make sure the truth comes out, no matter what it takes. Before Grace could respond, the sharp sound of a knock at the door interrupted them. Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat as the door creaked open, revealing 2 uniformed police officers standing on the threshold. They had arrived without warning, their presence both unexpected and ominous. Are you Nathaniel Hayes? One of the officers asked, his voice firm. Nathaniel nodded slowly, his chest tightening. Yes, that's me. We're here to talk to you about a serious matter, the officer continued. We've been investigating a case involving fraud, identity theft, and possible child trafficking. We have reason to believe your family may be involved. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. The police had arrived, just as Mark had warned. His mother's face drained of color, and she stepped back, her expression betraying her panic. The room seemed to close in on Nathaniel as the reality of the situation hit him all at once. This was no longer just a family matter. It had escalated into something far worse. Grace's eyes darted from the officers to Nathaniel, and for the first time, she seemed uncertain. I don't know what they're talking about, she stammered, trying to regain her composure. This is all a misunderstanding. But the officers weren't buying it. We need you to come with us, the second officer said, his tone leaving no room for argument. You're under investigation for your involvement in a scheme involving child trafficking. You have the right to remain silent. Nathaniel's mind spun as the officers read Grace her rights and guided her toward the door. His mother's expression was a mixture of fear and anger, but there was no denying the weight of the situation. This was real. The police were involved now, and there was no turning back. As the officers led Grace out of the house, Nathaniel stood frozen, unable to move. His entire world had just shifted beneath him, the floor pulled out from under him. The woman who had raised him, the woman he had trusted with everything, she was now a criminal in his eyes. The enormity of it all was almost too much to bear. Are you okay? Olivia's voice broke through the haze of his thoughts. He turned to see her standing in the doorway, her face pale and drawn with concern. She had witnessed the entire scene, her wide eyes searching his face for some kind of reassurance. Nathaniel swallowed hard, his voice hoarse. I don't know, Olivia. I don't know what's happening anymore. The police had taken Grace, and the house had fallen into an eerie silence. Nathaniel couldn't shake the images that haunted him. His mother's fear, her lies unraveling, the deep sense of betrayal that twisted his gut. As he sat in the living room, the weight of everything that had happened crashed down on him. He had been living in a world of illusion, a world where he had trusted the people closest to him without questioning their actions. And now, that world had shattered. Olivia sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. She was quiet, but Nathaniel could feel the tension in her, the confusion and fear mirrored in her eyes. Nathaniel, what are we going to do now? She asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't know the answer. Everything was too complicated, too entangled in lies and deception. His family was in pieces, his trust in them broken beyond repair. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. And yet, despite the overwhelming sense of betrayal, there was a small part of him that felt relief. The truth had come out. The lies were no longer hidden in the dark. I don't know, he said finally, his voice heavy with the burden of what he had just learned. But I do know that I can't keep living this way. I can't keep pretending like everything's okay when it's not. We need to figure out what comes next together. Olivia nodded, her eyes filled with sadness, but also a flicker of understanding. We will. We'll figure it out. But right now, we need to take care of Emma. She's all that matters. Nathaniel's heart swelled at the mention of his daughter. She was the one pure thing in all of this chaos, the one innocent soul who had been caught in the middle of his family's lies. He would protect her, no matter what. But as he sat there, lost in thought, another realization settled over him. The investigation was far from over. The police would continue to dig, and the truth would continue to unfold in ways that Nathaniel couldn't yet imagine. He had to brace himself for the consequences, for the emotional and legal battles that lay ahead. But there was one thing he knew for certain. He was no longer the same man who had walked into this mess. The person he had been before, trusting, naive, unaware of the darkness beneath his family's surface, was gone. And no matter how painful it would be, he would face whatever came next with clarity and strength. For Emma, for Olivia, for the truth. Days passed, and the investigation continued to unfold in front of Nathaniel and Olivia. It was a blur of legal papers, phone calls with lawyers, and visits from investigators, each piece of the puzzle coming together to reveal the full extent of the deception his family had orchestrated. Grace's arrest had sent shockwaves through their lives, and the fallout had only just begun. Nathaniel had thought he understood what it meant to protect his family, but he had been wrong. It wasn't about keeping the truth hidden. It was about confronting it, no matter how painful. The choices his family had made, his mother's betrayal, Mark's silence, the lies they had all told, had torn them apart, but Nathaniel was determined to rebuild. As the investigation progressed, Nathaniel took the difficult steps to ensure that Clara, Emma's biological mother, would have the opportunity to reclaim her daughter. The legal battles would be long and complicated, but Nathaniel was willing to fight for what was right. He knew that Emma deserved to be with her real mother, no matter how much it hurt him to let go. In the midst of the turmoil, Nathaniel and Olivia began to rebuild their relationship, slowly but surely. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, of frustration, and of grief, but they found a way to hold on to each other. They were both damaged by the truth, but they were also stronger for facing it together. And as Nathaniel looked at Emma, now a little older and beginning to smile more often, he knew one thing for certain. The family they had once dreamed of was gone, but they had the chance to create something new, something built on honesty, trust, and a deep love for the child who had been at the center of it all. The truth, though painful, had set them on a new path. And no matter where that path would lead, Nathaniel was ready to walk it, step by step, with Olivia and Emma by his side. The sun was setting on a quiet afternoon, casting a soft, golden light over the park where Nathaniel stood, watching as Emma ran through the grass, her laughter filling the air. It was a sound that, not long ago, had seemed like an impossible dream, a dream overshadowed by lies, betrayal, and a world that had crumbled beneath his feet. But now, standing there, watching his daughter, his real daughter, enjoying the simple freedom of childhood, Nathaniel felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. The storm of the past year, with its devastating truths and painful losses, had left its scars. But in the quiet moments like this one, he could see how far he had come, how much had changed. The investigation was over. His mother was facing the consequences of her actions, and the truth had finally been exposed. The wounds would take time to heal, but the pieces of his life were slowly being put back together. Olivia stood beside him, her presence a steady anchor. Together, they had weathered the storm, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, they had found something real, something worth fighting for. "We did it," Olivia said softly, her voice filled with quiet wonder as she watched Emma. "We got through it." Nathaniel nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, we did. We're still here. And that's all that matters." The journey had been long, painful, and full of hard truths. But through it all, Nathaniel had come to understand that family wasn't defined by blood alone. It was the people who showed up when things were at their darkest, the ones who stood beside you when everything else fell apart. And in the end, it was love, the real, unconditional kind, that had held them all together. He looked down at Olivia, a small smile tugging at his lips. No matter what happens from here on out, we've got each other. Olivia smiled back, a gentle, reassuring smile. Always. As they stood there, watching Emma play, Nathaniel knew that this was just the beginning. The truth had set them free, and now, they had the chance to build something new, something better. There would still be challenges ahead, and the scars of the past would always be a part of their story. But with Emma, with Olivia, and with the knowledge that they had done what was right, Nathaniel felt ready to face whatever the future held. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting its last rays over the park, Nathaniel felt a sense of hope rise within him. It was the kind of hope that came from surviving the worst and coming out stronger on the other side. It wasn't the life he had expected, but it was the life he had now. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. We want to extend a heartfelt thank you to all of you who followed the journey from start to finish. Your support and attention mean the world, and we truly appreciate you taking the time to experience this story with us. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions help us bring more content to you in the future. Share the story with friends and family. Let's continue growing this community together. Thank you once again for being a part of this journey. We hope to bring you even more exciting stories and content soon. Stay tuned and take care.